Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of My Boomer Buddies podcast, where we tell it like it was and is. We dip into the past, try to create some new memories. We have a great show ahead. We've got somebody on that is an expert in all things Beatles. In fact, he is the producer and creator and host of Love and Peace, a Beatles podcast. He knows so much about the Beatles. I think I know a lot, but he has forgotten more than I know. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so pleased to introduce my newest Boomer buddy, Tim Coffey. Tim, welcome to my Boomer Buddies podcast.
Rick, thank you. It's great to be with you and especially to talk about my favorite topic, which I'm passionate about, and that's the Beatles.
All right. So before we get started, tell us a little bit. Who is Tim Coffey? What's your story?
Well, I'm a septuagenarian, or whatever the proper term is. I'm retired in my fourth year of retirement from being the staff president of the Clear Lake Area Chamber of Commerce in Clear Lake, Iowa. I'm on the board of directors of the Iowa Rock and Roll Music Association. And in our local community college here in northern Iowa, I have taught 8 classes to lifelong learners on the Beatles, 4 as a group and 4 of the individuals. And I'll be doing one in March on the 60th anniversary of the Beatles coming to America. 60 years, Rick. Can you believe that?
I can't. I can remember. We're going to touch on this in a minute. I do want to say your podcast is wonderful. I listened to a couple episodes. The first one got me hooked, I have to say. And you can hear that on Buzzsprout. I encourage all of you out there, if you love the Beatles, want to know more about the Beatles, Tim Coffey is your guy. So Tim, tell me, how did you get your musical taste and how did you discover the Beatles?
Well, I think the long and short of it is I'm a child of the 60s. And I saw the Beatles by myself. I was a freshman in high school on Ed Sullivan, February 9th of this. We're taping this the week of the 60th anniversary. And my sister, who was living with us at the time, her husband was overseas and she was pregnant with her first child. She and I were sitting on the floor in front of the TV watching Ed Sullivan. And to this day, Rick, I can remember looking in the screen with the reflection of my parents in the background and my dad shaking his head like, oh.
There was 63 million people, right, watching that night. And we were, I remember watching, I was 2 months shy of my 7th birthday, but I still remember the impact it had on me at that early age.
Yeah. That kind of got me hooked. And very few people know this, but Brian Epstein was really kind of the father of the British invasion, in addition to the Beatles and being the manager of the Beatles. But he managed several other key British groups that came over. And so that British invasion kind of got me hooked. And of course, the music of the 60s and the early 70s are classic, and we still listen to it today.
Now, you mentioned you were a teenager. What music did you like before the Beatles invaded?
Well, I actually went to a Beach Boy concert. I'm originally from Omaha, Nebraska. Went to a Beach Boy concert, and my neighbor next door, who was my best friend at the time, growing up with him, he had a 45 record on the Swan label of She Loves You. And I had my one and only Beach Boys album with In My Room. And I told my buddy Lance, I said, hey, I will trade you my Beach Boy album for that She Loves You Beatles record. And he did. I still have it today. And the Beatles came over and they did the Swan label, but Swan never really had the money to promote them. Right. And so that's when EMI said, okay, Capitol, do your thing.
Let's shoot forward to the Ed Sullivan Show. Do you remember, I'm sure you know, the first song that they played and how you felt?
All My Lovin'. That was a classic. That was one of their hits. And I remember the screaming girls in the audience. And I can't remember the thousands of audience members outside who wanted to get in. They played in the first half hour and the second half hour. I think they played a total of either 4 or 5 songs for both sessions. And then, of course, they run Ed Sullivan the next 2 weeks also.
I remember when All My Loving started. That's a cold start. They
Oh,
get
yeah.
right into it. And I was hooked right there. And then I remember they played Till There Was You, She Loves You. That's when they showed on there on the screen the names of who everybody was.
Yeah,
And you know where I'm going? Remember what they
exactly.
put for John? Do you remember what they
Sorry,
put?
girls, he's married.
Right, right, right. And they were still screaming. That really changed things. That brings me to the impact that they had on the world. So let's talk about the evolution, Tim, of the Beatles. Let's start with their first album.
Well, the first album here in the United States, and I think the same for the UK, was Meet the Beatles, or I think over in the UK it was called the Beatles, and then here it's Meet the Beatles. And EMI owned Capitol Records, and so Capitol took up the brunt here in the United States. Um, the second album of the Beatles in the UK was called Beatles for Sale.
Mm.
And Capitol here, what they did was they chopped that up into two different albums. One was called the Beatles' second album, and then the other one was Beatles 65. And all of those uh, three albums had all of their hits. And ironically, in 1964, between February and April, the Beatles had the top five uh, records of the Billboard, of the
That's
top 100.
incredible.
And here's something really interesting that I didn't know until recently. I picked it up in the introduction of one of my new Beatle books. Um, During that same period, in the first quarter of 1964, the Beatles accounted for 64% of all record sales in the United States. Now, that alone is a huge achievement. So that shows you how this whole thing kind of propelled. And it all began with the press was really cynical here when they landed in the United States.
Mm.
And the Beatles held a press conference in the Pan Am room or whatever it was at JFK. And it was beginning at that press conference where the Beatles just charmed the pants off of the press with their humor, with their self-effacing remarks. And that really started, I'll use the term loosely for a while, a love affair between the press and the Beatles.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but didn't George have a quip that was really clever? How did you find America? We took a U-turn at Iceland or something like that.
Yeah, John said that. Turn left at Greenland. Yeah.
Is that what it was? Oh, I mean, yeah, no wonder they won over the press. They were just so witty. One of the albums that I really enjoyed was Help.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that album.
Epstein
Help.
got a contract for the Beatles for three movies: Hard Day's Night, Help, and then eventually Yellow Submarine, the cartoon
Mhm.
movie. Help was their second movie. It was in color. It was done in the UK, the Bahamas, I think the Swiss Alps. And ironically, the Beatles, via their marijuana smoking, thanks to Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
um, they were pretty well high throughout the entire movie. So the producers of Help really had to film their scenes of the Beatles first thing in the morning before the Beatles really got out of state, out of mind.
Right.
So, but that had a lot of really good songs in it, and certainly Help was one of them. Help was one of the songs. Another one is Hide Your Love Away, and then In My Life, what Beatle fans call John Lennon's Bob Dylan stage.
Mm.
And the Beatles were influenced an awful lot by Bob Dylan, and certainly girl groups too, but especially Bob Dylan. And again, when they first met him, Dylan got him hooked on marijuana too. But he was a big musical influence on him.
That brings us to Rubber Soul. That was a very creative album, wasn't it, Tim?
Yeah, and for a long time, my favorite album was Sgt. Pepper's, but I look back now, and I can truly say that my favorite album of all time of the Beatles is Rubber Soul. And I say that because this is where, for me at least, and I think for a lot of Beatle fans, you can start to see the musical change and growth of the Beatles. Um, they have kind of some standard songs that they had when they were still young and writing songs for the first time. But their musical growth just really shined, and that had "In My Life" on there by Lennon, the sitar used by George Harrison, um, yeah, and Michelle, the French song that John said, "Hey, Paul, you were jerking around with French for a long time. Um, Write a song about that," and that's when he came up with Michelle. So,
And then we move into 1966, Tim, and we hit the album Revolver, where they continue their growth.
oh yeah. Well, Rubber Soul was called the Pod album. Revolver was called the LSD album. And again, it reflected kind of the music of the times and the music trends that the Beatles set. Lennon had a song on there that really kind of took the musical world by storm, in the sense that it was really the first heavy metal music or song. But Revolver, it really was the additional growth album of the Beatles post Rubber Soul. It really built upon it. And then, of course, after that was Sgt. Pepper, what was initially called a concept album, but there were just 2 songs that were concept, and the rest were Beatles songs. But yeah. And 1966, by the way, too, was the year that the Beatles made a very conscious, a very deliberate decision of no more touring either.
They couldn't hear themselves play anymore, therefore not really enjoying it anymore, correct?
Yeah, correct. And they almost got thrown into jail in the Philippines by the Marcos. Imelda Marcos planned a reception for the Beatles that the Beatles didn't know about, so they didn't show. She got really all upset, and the Beatles played their concert and were told to watch out. So the Beatles ran to the plane to get on the plane. They barely got their equipment on. I think they actually lost some equipment, but yeah, the police were after them. So,
And Tim, we need to talk about Magical Mystery Tour. That had some songs I really enjoyed.
yeah, that was a great album, and it was one of my favorites in the sense that I went away for my freshman year in college, and that's when it came out, and so I that was my away from home album, and I really latched on to a bunch of the songs. Interesting stories behind Magical Mystery Tour. They did that after Brian died,
Oh,
and
right.
it was Paul's idea about doing a film, and so they did a film related to that. Not a well, yeah, it was they filmed it for a TV special. That's what I should say,
Sure.
and um, it really didn't have any continuity at all. It didn't have any theme beyond it was the Beatles. They would sing some songs and this and that. Um, the other 3 Beatles besides Paul went along with it just to humor Paul,
Okay.
but it turned out to be the TV show, at least, to be the first flop of the Beatles. And of course, people said, well, that's because Brian's not there and the whole bit.
Sure.
But later, I mean, years later, it's become an underground classic in the TV sense. But yeah, the music, again, part of the seamless, timeless music of the Beatles. Magical Mystery Tour and, yeah, Fool on the Hill.
Love
Uh,
that.
oh, yeah. And Paul did a little video of that um, when he went to France and had that as a background.
So they
So,
did the first music videos.
yeah, they did. And they did it with Ed Sullivan.
Great stuff.
Strawberry Field and Penny Lane in 65, 66. And yeah, they could be indirectly the cause of MTV. But Magical Mystery Tour was unique simply because of its circumstances, the timing. But again, Beatles being the true Beatles, um, the music was there, and it kept them going.
Next, we had the Beatles.
The White Album is unique and different in itself. A lot of Beatle fans say that that's their favorite album. It's one of my favorite albums, but this is kind of post India. The
Mhm.
Beatles went over with Marisha to India, and George was into Eastern religion and themes. And uh, John and George stayed a month. Paul and Ringo stayed 2 weeks. But in that period, the Beatles wrote 38 songs, most of which came out on the White Album. And, they had enough material to actually do three albums. But they debated, should we do two albums, just one each? So they decided to do a double album, and that was their first one. But it's simply called The Beatles, but not everybody refers to it as a White Album.
Right. And do you have a favorite cut off of that album?
I Will by McCartney and Julia are two of my favorite songs.
Yeah.
The little ditty of Why Don't We Do It on the Road is kind of humorous and a little filler.
I like Dear Prudence.
Dear Prudence was great, and Prudence Farrell was one of the attendees in India, and so Lennon wrote that, and have at it with Prudence, and Dear Prudence, won't you come out to play?
And that was 1968, the White Album. Now we jump into 1969, Yellow Submarine.
Yellow Submarine, and that was part of their contractual part. Paul wrote Yellow Submarine really for Ringo.
Mm-hmm.
Ringo sang, and the Blue Meanies, and all of that in the cartoon. But again, that was part of the three contract movies deals that Brian set up. But it was a good album. It had some really good songs. Bulldog. Let's see, one or two others that I can recall. But yeah, a good little album with some orchestral music on it. But yeah.
So then we moved to 1969. One of the albums I really enjoyed, nostalgic reasons, Abbey Road.
Abbey Road, ironically, was their last album that they did together. Let It Be was their last album released, but done before Abbey Road. Abbey Road was really an appropriate ending, ironically, of the Beatles. They were together. They recorded like they originally did and had fun and enjoyed the recording. George Martin, the producer, was very hesitant to produce another album because of the discord of the Beatles. The Beatles found that they were in more business meetings than they were in the studio, and they weren't used to that. They weren't business people, and Abbey Road was really an appropriate way to end. And, ironically, George Harrison had two great hits on that.
Oh, yeah.
Something and Here Comes the Sun. All through the Beatles, Paul was always telling George, here's what to do, here's how to play. And of course, that really got under George's skin, as it would anybody. But it was George's turn to tell Paul, this is what I want on something. This is how you play on Here Comes the Sun. And George was in his height doing that.
Well, that talent finally got released.
Yeah. He turned out to be an incredible songwriter in and of himself. Hard to compete with a duo like Lennon and McCartney, but he really showed his songwriting ability.
Yes, sir. I really enjoyed George to this day. I appreciate him more and more. And that brings us to 1970, Let It Be. And you mentioned that was actually recorded previously.
Yeah. That, in hindsight and looking back on it, and you see videos and clips of the recording aspects of that, was their Discord album. And I say that because that's where the Beatles really had a huge amount of tension. And Ringo walked out. George walked out. They got Ringo back in, and they had the entire floor was covered with flowers when Ringo came back. George on the tape on the Get Back tape that I have told Paul, he said, I'll play whatever you want. You can tell me how to play in whatever way you want, and it really was. It was an album that was good, but boy, there was a lot of, like I said, discord and disagreements behind it, and to some degree, you could see the demise of the Beatles starting right there.
That documentary really laid it out. I'm sad to see. We're talking with Tim Coffey. He knows so much about the Beatles, and there's so much more to talk about. Now let's get to the singles, shall we, Tim?
Okay.
That they did after the breakup. Free as a Bird.
Yeah, that was John's song. He wrote that. The Beatles finished it and added to it. But to their credit, they gave the songwriting credit instead of Lennon McCartney. It was Lennon. And that was again, a fitting way to end a a partnership, a family of brothers, a band. It was a tribute also to John, who should have been around to actually be part of the live recording.
Right. Now, I show that was 1995.
Yeah.
And then we've got Real Love, and that's a 79 demo by John, correct?
Yeah. And again, Paul and George added on to that. And that came out about the same time as Free as a Bird. Again, showed that John, even though he spent most of his remainder years as a single Beatle, he did a lot of music, but he spent the last 4 or 5 years of his life raising Sean and being a father to Sean. He still has some really good songwriting ability.
It's nice that they were able to rework that and make it sound like a Beatles song.
Yep.
Last November, they released Now and Then. What's your take on that, Tim?
You know, what an appropriate title, Now and Then. Paul said this is the last Beatle single that'll come out, even though it's been reported they have a lot more music that can still come out. But it's an appropriate way to say goodbye and thank you and adieu to Beatle fans. And again, I think John had a lot to do with that song. So it's a great way for the band to get together on record, on tape, not through AI, as all of this garbage has been talked about.
Right.
It's very appropriate. But I did read in something I get daily about the Beatles that there's more music that may or may not come out, but who knows?
Well, let's talk now. We went through the anthology of their music, and it was fun to revisit all of that. What was the lasting impact, in your opinion, Tim, that the Beatles left us musically and culturally?
Well, certainly the music. To me, the music is timeless. I mean, there's a Beatles channel on Sirius, and Michael Jackson bought the Beatle music, and it was resold after his death. You hear some Beatle music, unfortunately, for commercials, which John and Paul probably, just scream about. John certainly didn't want to have that done. But the music, above and beyond, their influence in other bands, in music, their impact on the record industry, but really their impact on the world. They had an impact musically, socially, fashion-wise, politically. John was over here and wanted a green card, and he was set to go visit his Aunt Mimi before he got shot and killed. He had that go back and forth with President Nixon, who thought that John was nothing but a peacenik and a disturber for the Vietnam protest. But love and peace and love was what the Beatles stood for a lot in their music and their songs. And I think that, to me, that's one of their lasting impacts was they never had hate of any type in their music. They never had any negative things in their music. It was all fun, rock and roll, and uplifting.
Well said. And Tim Coffey, check out his podcast, Love and Peace, a Beatles podcast on Buzzsprout, Spotify. I'm fortunate that we met through Ed Hallback, who helped form our podcasting group, and you got to know Trevor J. Brown, and I think it's been a beautiful partnership. We've been on each other's shows now, and we'll keep it going. It's been just wonderful having you here, Tim, and I know I will have you back if you'll come back. I think you will.
Absolutely.
For Tim Coffey, I'm Rick Reed. My Boomer Buddies podcast. We'll see you around the block.